At my daughter's wedding, she said, "You're just walking me down the aisle, don't make it about you." Then I found out she introduced her stepfather as the real dad in the program. So I stepped outside, called the venue manager, and canceled the remaining balance. Within an hour, the lights went out and the staff started packing up in the middle of their first dance. I, 52M, thought I'd be walking my daughter down the aisle with pride, but instead I walked straight into the biggest betrayal of my life. 22 years ago, my ex-wife walked out on us when our daughter was barely 3. She couldn't handle the responsibility, she said. Couldn't handle being tied down. I watched my little girl cry herself to sleep night after night, asking when mommy was coming home. I was the one who held her through nightmares, taught her to ride a bike, helped with homework until midnight, and worked double shifts to afford dance lessons and soccer camps. When my daughter was 8, her mother remarried some finance guy with deep pockets. Suddenly, she wanted to be involved again. Wanted weekends. Wanted summers. My daughter, desperate for her mother's attention, embraced this new family dynamic. I bit my tongue and shared custody because I thought it was best for her. Her stepfather was decent enough, I'll admit. He paid for things I couldn't afford. Private school, college tuition, a car for her 16th birthday. But I was still the one she called at 2 a.m. during her freshman year breakdown. Still the one who drove 4 hours when she got food poisoning sophomore year. Still the one who listened to every heartbreak and celebrated every achievement. Last month, she got engaged to a guy I genuinely liked. When she asked me to walk her down the aisle, I nearly cried. Despite everything, despite feeling like I was slowly being replaced by her stepfather's wallet, she still wanted her dad for that moment. The wedding planning was stressful. Her mother and stepfather insisted on funding most of it, which meant they controlled most decisions. I contributed what I could, the rehearsal dinner, her wedding shoes, small things that mattered to me. I just wanted to be part of my daughter's day. The morning of the wedding, I was nervous but excited. I'd practiced my father of the bride speech for weeks. I'd picked out the perfect tie. I was ready to give my little girl the send-off she deserved. When I arrived at the venue for photos, my daughter seemed tense. She kept checking her phone and avoiding eye contact. I chalked it up to wedding jitters. When the photographer suggested some father-daughter shots, she barely smiled. During our private moment before the ceremony, I told her how proud I was of the woman she'd become. How honored I felt to be walking her down the aisle. That's when she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold and distant. She told me I was just walking her down the aisle and not to make it about me. The words hit like a slap. I asked what she meant, and she just turned away, saying she had to finish getting ready. Confused and hurt, I stepped outside for air. That's when I ran into my brother, who'd driven in from out of state. He was holding the wedding program, looking uncomfortable. He asked if I'd seen it yet. My hands shook as I read through the glossy pages. Under the wedding party section, there it was in elegant script. Father of the bride. Stepfather's name. My name appeared nowhere. Not as a parent, not in the special thanks, nowhere. 22 years of raising her, and I'd been erased completely. But that wasn't the worst part. In the program's dedication section, there was a heartfelt message about how grateful she was to the man who'd raised her with love and support, who'd been her rock through every challenge. She was talking about her stepfather. The man who'd been in her life for 14 years was being credited for everything I'd done for 22. My chest felt tight. I couldn't breathe properly. My brother put his hand on my shoulder and asked what I wanted to do. For the first time in years, I didn't know. I walked back inside, program clutched in my hand, and approached my daughter's bridal suite. Through the partially open door, I could hear her talking to her bridesmaids about how excited she was for her real dad to see her walk down the aisle. She was talking about him, her stepfather. The woman doing her makeup asked about me, and my daughter waved dismissively. She said I was just there for tradition, but her stepfather was the one who really mattered, the one who'd actually been a father to her. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. This was my daughter, the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap during Disney movies, who insisted I check under her bed for monsters every night until she was 10, who'd called me her hero on countless occasions. But she'd made her choice. She'd chosen the narrative where I was just the biological father, and he was the real dad, where my 2 decades of sacrifice and love were irrelevant compared to his financial contributions and recent presents. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the venue manager's number. I'd spoken with her several times during the planning process about the payment schedule. The final balance, nearly $15,000, was due today. I'd planned to pay it that morning, but got caught up in the emotion of the day. My finger hovered over the call button. If I didn't make this payment, there would be consequences. The vendors would pack up. The reception would end. My daughter's perfect day would be ruined. But what about my perfect day? What about 22 years of perfect days I'd given her? I hit call. The venue manager answered cheerfully, asking if I was calling about the final payment. I told her there wouldn't be one. There was silence, then confusion. She explained what would happen if the balance wasn't paid within the hour. Vendors would leave, music would stop, lights would be shut off according to their contract. I told her I understood and hung up. My brother found me sitting in my car. He could see I'd made some kind of decision and didn't argue when I told him what I'd done. He just asked if I was sure. I showed him the program again and asked if he thought I was being unreasonable. He shook his head and got in the passenger seat. The ceremony went ahead as planned. I walked my daughter down the aisle, her arm light on mine, her smile radiant for everyone else, but strangely absent when she looked at me. When the officiant asked who was giving her away, her stepfather stood up from the front row and spoke. I wasn't even acknowledged. During the kiss and recession, I slipped out quietly. Several relatives asked where I was going, but I just said I needed some air. My brother followed, and we watched from the parking lot as guests moved into the reception space. The first dance started right on schedule. My daughter looked beautiful in her flowing dress, spinning in her new husband's arms. The photographer captured every moment. Her mother and stepfather watched proudly from their head table seats. Then, exactly 58 minutes after my call, the music cut out mid-song. The lights went dark except for the emergency lighting. Confused murmurs filled the room as staff members appeared and began quietly but efficiently packing up equipment. The venue manager appeared and spoke quietly with the wedding party. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see the shock on my daughter's face as the reality set in. Her perfect wedding was ending abruptly, and she had no idea why. Guests started gathering their belongings as waitstaff cleared tables. The band was packing up their instruments. The DJ was wrapping cables. The beautiful reception space that had cost thousands to decorate was being dismantled piece by piece. My phone buzzed with texts. First from my ex-wife, angry and demanding to know where I was. Then from my daughter, asking if I knew what was happening. Then from her new husband, wondering if there was some emergency. I turned off my phone and told my brother it was time to leave. As we drove away, I could see my daughter in my rearview mirror, still in her wedding dress, standing in the parking lot looking lost and confused. Part of me wanted to turn around, to fix this, to make her day perfect again despite everything. But a bigger part of me remembered that program. Remembered being erased from my own daughter's wedding. Remembered being called irrelevant while someone else took credit for raising the woman I'd loved and sacrificed for since she was 3 years old. Update 1. The text started within 2 hours. First from family members who'd been at the wedding, confused about what had happened. Then from my ex-wife, who'd apparently figured out I was responsible. Her messages went from confused to angry to absolutely furious within the span of 20 minutes. My daughter's first text came around midnight. She asked simply if I'd caused the reception to end. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to think about what I wanted to say, if anything. The next morning brought phone calls I ignored. My brother stayed with me that night, understanding that I needed support, but also space to process what I'd done. He didn't judge my decision, but I could tell he was worried about the long-term consequences. Around noon, my daughter showed up at my house. She was no longer in her wedding dress, obviously, but she still looked beautiful despite the exhaustion and anger in her eyes. She demanded to know why I'd ruined her wedding. I invited her in and showed her the program. I asked her to explain why I'd been completely erased from her wedding materials while her stepfather was credited as her father. I asked her to explain the conversation I'd overheard about her real dad. She got defensive immediately. She said her stepfather had paid for most of the wedding, had been there for her through high school and college, had walked her through difficult times. She said he deserved recognition. I asked what about the 22 years before he came into her life? What about the nights I stayed up with her when she was sick? What about teaching her to drive, helping with college applications, being her shoulder to cry on through every heartbreak? She said that wasn't the same thing, that he'd been more of a father figure during her adult years, which mattered more, that I was being selfish and jealous. The conversation escalated quickly. She accused me of ruining the most important day of her life out of spite. I accused her of rewriting history to erase my role in raising her. We both said things we probably shouldn't have. She left angry, saying she needed time to think about whether she wanted me in her life at all if this was how I was going to behave. The words stung more than I expected. Update 2. 3 days later, my ex-wife called. Not texted, called. She was surprisingly calm, which was somehow worse than if she'd been screaming. She told me my daughter was devastated, that I'd embarrassed the entire family, that this was exactly the kind of selfish behavior that had driven her away years ago. I almost laughed at that last part. The woman who abandoned her 3-year-old daughter was lecturing me about selfish behavior. But she said something that stuck with me. She asked what I'd hoped to accomplish. Did I think humiliating my daughter would make her love me more? Did I think destroying her wedding would prove my importance in her life? I didn't have good answers to those questions. My brother visited again that weekend. We talked through everything that had happened. He understood why I'd reacted the way I did, but he also pointed out that my daughter was probably just trying to navigate a complicated family situation. Maybe the program thing wasn't meant as maliciously as I'd taken it. I started thinking about that conversation differently. Maybe my daughter hadn't set out to hurt me. Maybe she was trying to balance her relationship with her mother and stepfather, who had funded the wedding, with her relationship with me. Maybe I'd misread the situation entirely. But then I remembered her words about me just walking her down the aisle and not making it about me. I remembered the coldness in her voice. Those weren't the words of someone trying to navigate a difficult situation diplomatically. Those were the words of someone who genuinely saw me as secondary to her stepfather. Still, I began to wonder if I'd overreacted. If there might have been a better way to handle the situation. If I'd destroyed something that could never be repaired over a misunderstanding. I decided to reach out. I sent my daughter a text asking if we could meet to talk. No accusations, no demands, just a conversation. She didn't respond for 2 days, then finally agreed to meet for coffee. Update 3. The coffee meeting was awkward from the start. My daughter looked tired and stressed. She told me the wedding fiasco had caused problems with her new in-laws, who didn't understand what had happened. Her husband was trying to be supportive, but he was also confused and hurt that his wedding had been ruined. I apologized for the timing and the public nature of what I'd done. I explained that I hadn't planned to hurt her, but seeing the program and hearing her dismiss my role in her life had triggered something I couldn't control. She listened, but I could tell she was still angry. She said she understood I was hurt, but that didn't justify ruining her wedding in front of everyone she cared about. She said there were better ways to handle the situation. I agreed with her on that point. I asked if she could help me understand why she'd written the program that way. Why she'd excluded me entirely while crediting her stepfather as her father. Her explanation surprised me. She said her mother and stepfather had insisted on reviewing all wedding materials since they were paying for most of it. They'd suggested the wording changes, positioning it as honoring the man who'd been there for her education and major life events. She admitted she'd gone along with it partly to avoid conflict, but partly because she did feel grateful to her stepfather for his support during her adult years. She said she hadn't thought about how it would make me feel because she assumed I knew how important I was to her. But then I asked about the conversation I'd overheard, about her real dad, and me just being there for tradition. She looked uncomfortable and admitted she'd been trying to impress her bridesmaids, several of whom had complicated relationships with their biological fathers. She said she'd gotten caught up in the narrative her mother had been pushing for years. The conversation was painful but illuminating. I could see that my daughter hadn't set out to hurt me, but she had allowed others to influence her into diminishing my role. She'd chosen the path of least resistance, even when it meant erasing 22 years of my love and sacrifice. I told her I loved her and always would, but that I couldn't pretend what had happened was okay. I needed time to figure out how to move forward from this. She started crying and asked if I would ever be able to forgive her. I told her forgiveness wasn't the issue. The issue was trust and respect. I needed to know that she valued our relationship enough to protect it from outside influence. That she wouldn't throw away everything we'd built together to avoid difficult conversations with her mother and stepfather. We ended the conversation without resolution, but with better understanding. She promised to think about everything we'd discussed. I promised to consider whether there was a path forward for our relationship. That was 6 weeks ago. We've texted a few times since then, nothing substantial. I know she's been talking to my brother, trying to understand my perspective better. I've been talking to a counselor, trying to work through my own feelings about the situation. The wedding fallout has rippled through our extended family. Some relatives think I was justified, others think I went too far. My daughter's relationship with her mother and stepfather has apparently become strained as she started questioning their role in the wedding program situation. I don't know what happens next. I love my daughter, but I can't unknow what I learned about how she really sees me. I can't unfeel the pain of being erased from her wedding after 22 years of being her primary parent. Maybe time will heal this. Maybe we'll find a way back to each other. Or maybe this is just the natural end of a relationship that was more one-sided than I wanted to admit. What I do know is that I don't regret standing up for myself, even if I regret how I did it. For too many years, I stayed silent while my role in my daughter's life was slowly diminished. I swallowed my pride and accepted being secondary to people who showed up later but contributed more financially. That night at the wedding, I reached my limit. I finally said no. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't mature, but it was honest. Sometimes that has to be enough.